Good evening, everyone. In the following stories we'll explore fascinating accounts of encounters with the supernatural, narratives that challenge what many would deem possible. We invite you to join us, whether for mere entertainment or deeper reflection on mysteries beyond our human understanding. Always remember, the world is vast and full of surprises, many beyond our everyday comprehension. Who knows, soon you might have your own tale to tell, a moment that will expand your horizons beyond the ordinary. Let's begin with today's story. When I was 17, my father was diagnosed with cancer. He went through the entire process of battling cancer until the very end. The treatment itself could be overwhelmingly difficult for anyone, but it also had a positive impact on everyone around him. My mother was unwavering in her support and prayers, dedicating herself daily, morning and night, as she had been taught since childhood. After 2 years of treatment that completely changed his life, and also 2 years of unwavering faith and dedication from my mother to God, my father, against all odds, survived. My mother believed that God had placed him in the hands of the best doctors to save him, and that he helped make each chemotherapy session as effective as possible. She felt she had a strong influence on my father's survival. Thus, she decided to devote all her free time from then on. I started attending the church in our community, especially to support people in need, those feeling hopeless, who needed to hear their experiences and messages of faith. Before this, my parents, although raised Catholic, had become staunch atheists and skeptics of everything, and that's how they taught us to be, both my older sister and me. We didn't believe in anything, let alone that God could have saved my father. It seemed disrespectful to the doctors and science, and we couldn't help but mock my mother's change a little. However, as we always do in this family, we decided to support her. I would go with her to church whenever I could, especially because it's on a very lonely and dark street, much like many others in our community. That street was increasingly filled with abandoned houses rather than inhabited ones. I remember going to pick up my mother one Saturday. They had performed First Communion ceremonies before I arrived. There were only a few people taking photos outside the church. Inside, it was empty and the lights were beginning to dim. It was night. I entered and sat in the back row to wait. The priest told me that my mother was in the small office next to the church with another volunteer and that she would not be long. He also asked me to reluctantly take off my cap, which I did. Someone outside spoke to him, perhaps to take a photo, and he left, closing the church doors behind him. So, I stayed inside alone, with only a couple of candles still lit on the altar illuminating the church, and I realized how eerie it could be. I thought about all the people who came there every day to pray, to plead for help, so to speak. I saw so many people who attended convinced of the existence of the supernatural. Isn't it the same thing? I was thinking about that when I realized I wasn't alone. In the front row, something suddenly rose with a white veil, as if lying down and then sat up. From the little that protruded from the bench, I thought it was a child. I stood up to approach and see if there was anyone else there to tell them how to get out, as we couldn't open the door that the priest closed. As I took a few steps forward, I could see that it was indeed a girl who was making her first communion. She was still sitting there in her dress, as if waiting for someone. Perhaps she had no family and was just waiting for the priest. Maybe her parents hadn't been able to come. Her dress had long sleeves and was beautiful, but very old-fashioned, from another time, and a bit too big for her. Besides, it wasn't uncommon for poorer children to wear borrowed clothes. I heard her singing softly, as if praying aloud, and it made me feel sorry for her, thinking she was alone. So, I cleared my throat and spoke so she would know I was there, to prevent her from running away if she suddenly saw me. "Hello, the priest will be back soon. He's already closed up. They're not waiting for you outside," I told her. When I said that, she turned abruptly toward me. Her eyes barely cleared the back of the bench, but I couldn't see them because of the veil she wore. She stood up and walked toward the door on her left, leading to the offices. Her dress dragged strangely, so I couldn't see how her feet moved as she walked. She didn't shift an inch of her body, as if she were stiff and just advancing. I shouted to her that the exit wasn't that way, that she couldn't go in there. I got up to walk behind her and realized how loud my footsteps echoed in the church as I hurried along. I noticed I didn't hear her footsteps. I followed her down the long hallway next to the church, which led on one side to the office and on the other to an exit at the back. To my left, I saw the light on in the office where my mother was, but the girl headed to the right, toward the door. I followed her at a distance to make sure she was okay, that there wasn't someone waiting behind the church. There was nothing back there but a vacant lot the size of several blocks. Very dark. I knew sometimes people parked their cars back there. The girl left the door open. I walked over there. On the other side, there was only darkness. There wasn't a single light outside. As I reached the door, I could see her about 15 meters away, barely visible in the darkness of that night. And suddenly, that white dress fell to the ground. The one who kept walking was a woman with completely wrinkled skin. So wrinkled that she didn't even look like an elderly person. It was something I had never seen before. She shuffled her feet and the dress lay on the ground as she moved towards the darkness. Although they may mock me now, at that moment I thought she was an elderly woman who might need help, disoriented. I had seen something similar with a relative of my grandfather's, so I tried to follow her to help. I passed by the dress and tried to look for her, but as I moved away from the church, the darkness of the night prevented me from seeing anything, not even where I was stepping. I took out my phone, but it seemed to illuminate only the moisture of the night, forming a slight mist around me. The light only served me when I pointed it at the ground, but there was nothing. I decided to go back to inform the priest, and to my mom, but as we passed by the dress, that white stain on the floor was no longer there. It was a kind of cement bag, half on the ground, half buried. I ran in confused to the hall. I heard voices. The father was leaning on the office door, joking with my mom and the other volunteer. I walked hurriedly there, and I told them what I had just seen, the faces of my mom and the lady. Changed completely, but the priest simply scolded me, told me not to go around saying those things, not playing with that, and he retired, leaving through that same door that gave back. The other lady was pale, said nothing. My mom just told me to hurry up and take her things. We left. The three of us and started walking. The lady could cross the first street to get quickly to her house, but she chose to walk with us. Well, I didn't say anything else. I didn't ask anything. The lady said goodbye when we arrived home and left. It was the only time I tried to ask my mom about what I saw. She said there was no need to talk about it, that she didn't believe in such things, and that I should find a logical explanation. When I finally mentioned it, my sister made fun of me a lot for believing in ghosts. Since then, every time there's a First Communion and I have to pick up my mom from the church, believe me, I have never done it again. Just hello, Uriel, good evening. I hope everyone is well. I've been listening to your program for 8 years thanks to one of my aunts. Since I was a child, I've been sensitive to these paranormal things. I've always had the misfortune of being able to see things that others. No, in fact, that's why I started listening to the program. I have many stories, but this time I'm going to tell you about a creature that I've heard mentioned in other stories. I suppose that the ability to see things that others cannot is not limited only to ghosts, or perhaps creatures like this one are also in some way. I'm from Mexico City, but when I was a child, I went with my mom and brother to a town called La Encanada in Zamora, Michoacan. When I was 7 years old, it was the first sighting. I was with my grandfather and he left me for a moment while he went to buy tamales with a lady nearby. I sat on a bench in front of our house looking at the sky. Back then, it was full of stars, not like now. I enjoyed gazing at it for a long time, watching the stars. Soon I saw something in that night sky, covering the stars, flying about 50 meters from me. It looked like a man, a human with wings, a black figure flying with its wings barely moving. I vividly remember how I ran to tell my mom and grandma that I had seen a completely black-winged man flying over the town. Of course, it only elicited laughter from them. No one at home believed me. We lived with my grandparents, uncles, my mom's siblings, her, my brother, and me, totaling 7 of us. We were all having dinner days after I saw that, and as it grew late, I fell asleep in the living room as usual. Someone picked me up and took me to my bed. After a while, I heard my brother laughing with my uncles and grandparents watching TV. They were near the room in the living room. I listened to them for a few seconds before falling back asleep. When something woke me again, this time it was something in my room. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. I got up and headed towards the living room where everyone else was. However, Something made me turn back before leaving, towards my bed. Right behind me, I saw something standing next to the bed. A dark figure with horns, wrapped in what seemed to be some kind of fabric, as if it had wings enveloping its body. Took me a few seconds to gather the courage to run and scream. My grandmother ran to hug me, and I told her what I had seen. She was the only one who believed me, saying she had also first felt a sense of dread in her chest and then a repugnant odor that suddenly filled the house. Fortunately, it was the last time I saw it. I never saw that creature again, neither at home nor in the sky, nowhere. 2 years ago, I returned to the capital to live with my dad. My mom stayed back in the village with her husband and my brother. Many years have passed since that vision, but a few days ago, my mom called me to tell me that the tamale lady had just passed away, the one she used to go with my grandpa. We always appreciated her a lot, and I hope she rests in peace. During the call, I noticed my mom wanted to tell me something more. She just didn't know how. That creature, the one I saw and was teased about, had been seen again, this time by several people in the village. The first to tell her was one of her friends, who recounted with much fear that he had seen a gargoyle. Then, a few days later, seemingly unrelated, his wife passed away. Later, at the church they attend, grandparents, a sister told them that one of her grandsons, along with his father, had seen a demonic being flying almost over them on the way back to the village. She said they had seen the same thing. The young man, 3 days later, attempted to take his own life. He said he was obeying voices that suddenly came into his head. Most recently, some men heard a very loud flapping just outside their house. They came out scared because they had never heard anything like it before. They say they saw a man flying away, and right after that, gunshots rang out throughout the town. Everyone shot. Other men were very scared. That's when suddenly I remembered everything I had lived through and tried to forget. Immediately, I confronted my mom for not believing me. Even her husband, when he heard about all these sightings, told her that he had also seen it, but a long time ago. When I was a teenager, once I went with my dad to a small village nearby called Tetquario. Both of us saw an animal by the roadside, something that looked like a man with wings eating something. I don't know what it was that I saw so long ago. I know that in the village, theories started to circulate about it. Some say it's one thing, others say it's a witch. No one really knows, and we'll probably never know the truth. Hopefully, community, you never encounter it, because if there's one thing I do believe is true, it brings with it tragedies. Good evening. I'm very glad that you're still here, that you're part of that brave percentage who managed to finish an entire episode. Thank you, as always, for continuing to share this project with your friends, on your social media, in your stories. Subscribing and rating if you liked it really helps us. Thumbs up or giving us 5 stars, depending on where you're listening from. You can also find us on all social media as RDLNO Official. Seriously, it's always a pleasure to chat with you, to see how you show us where you listen from. If you listen to this program with your family, please don't hesitate to share it with us. It brings us so much joy and truly fuels us when we see things like this that make us want to continue with this project for a lifetime. But for now, it's time to continue with more stories tonight. Good night. I hope someone hears my story. It all happened one time when I was returning home after a vacation in Mexico City 3 years ago. Whenever I had the chance, I would visit my family who lives there. I've been living in Querétaro for 5.5 years now. For those who are not from Mexico or are not familiar with Querétaro, it's a very beautiful, tranquil 2.5 hours from the capital. On that occasion, I traveled with my family but had to return early due to work commitments. I returned alone. My wife and children stayed there to finish visiting both paternal and maternal sides of the family, and besides, they were somewhat sick. We had taken advantage of that trip to fumigate the main room for a plague that had appeared on certain days we were not at home. So, when I returned early and couldn't get into my room, I had to stay on a sofa bed we had in the living room. There was a heavy rain in the city that night, so strong that it knocked something down nearby and left us without power. All you could hear was the rain and the wind. In the dark on the sofa, I tried to sleep because the next day would be a tough day at work. But the discomfort of being there and the noises from outside kept me from sleeping. It was very late at night, and I tossed back and forth on the couch, trying to find a comfortable position. Suddenly, when I turned towards the living room, I noticed there was a little boy next to me, about 2 years old, wearing a jumpsuit identical to one of my children's. The worst part was when he spoke to me and asked if he could stay with me. He said he was scared of the storm and couldn't sleep. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The only children in or near my house were indeed my own, who were currently in another city. I was supposed to be home alone. I didn't know how to react, but I decided to act as if I hadn't noticed. With dread, I told him to go to sleep, as I had to work very early the next day and couldn't afford to stay up. "Don't be afraid," I said. "It's just a storm. I hoped that vision would go away, that it would move away or simply disappear in the blink of an eye, but it didn't happen that way." He stayed by my bedside for a long time, not leaving, never stopping staring at me. I didn't know what to do. Closing my eyes scared me as much as continuing to see him. I felt that if I closed my eyes, he would suddenly come closer. His face remained hidden in the darkness, illuminated only by the window light that revealed a jumpsuit similar to my baby's. Again and again, I told myself the same thing. Finally, he asked me to hold him with no other choice. Not knowing what else to do, I gave up and drew strength from the memory of my family, summoning the courage to face it despite feeling very scared. I couldn't do anything else, so I stood up and carried him without looking at him. I can still feel him pressed against my body, feel his weight. He asked me to take him to the window to see the storm. I walked over there. The rain didn't let up, until suddenly I realized that I was already watching the sunrise. The sunlight was peeking through some clouds. I noticed I had my arms crossed, with nothing between them, just the posture as if I were still holding a baby. It was 6 in the morning. I called my wife on the phone to check on the kids. Suddenly, I was very worried about them, as we had been told days earlier that something might be wrong with them. Early signs of pneumonia were the other reason they decided to stay in Mexico City and not come back with me. My wife reassured me everything was fine, asked me what was wrong, heard me sounding very ill. I just told her I had a dream where the children were very sick. I couldn't explain more. At that moment, I stood by the window looking outside. What the rain had left clear that there was time for one more story. Community, let's go with a short story, but no less impactful when we share stories. This is how I like to remind you to share your experiences, even if sometimes you feel they are too short or lacking details. All are very valuable. We're closing with one last story in this episode. Rest well and good night. Good evening, community. My name is Evelyn Chacon, and tonight I want to share a short story, an anecdote that, despite its simplicity, had a profound impact on me. I swear to you that everything I'm about to tell you is real, without exaggerating a single detail. This happened in Chicoloapan, state of Mexico. As many of you may know, I study architecture, which involves many team projects. Some of my classmates and I often gather at a friend's house that is convenient for all of us to work on these projects. However, there's a detail. She lives a few steps away from a cemetery. On the night I'm about to recount, we had gathered to work on a particularly complicated model because we were behind schedule. We decided to stay awake all night if necessary. Despite all the coffees and conversations to try to stay awake, around 3 in the morning, we were literally falling asleep. Almost everyone was nodding off. A classmate suggested we sleep for at least an hour and then continue, even though it wasn't ideal. We were so tired that we agreed. Each of us found a corner to settle in. I sat on a couch in the living room. At that moment, we heard a distant cry in the street and nervously started laughing. It sounded almost ghostly, but being together, it didn't scare us much. Besides, it had sounded very far away. Someone joked that now we could say we had heard La Llorona. That's when I realized everything that's said about her, especially one detail. If you hear her from afar, it means she's already very music close. We heard her again very clearly, although hearing her so close now meant, according to belief, that she was moving away. Hearing her as if she were outside the house was extremely terrifying. Instinctively, we turned towards the door and the windows, all of which seemed to be completely closed. We thought everything was fine and that it was all over, thinking it was just someone outside playing a prank. but we saw a rosary that my classmate had hanging next to the door, spinning and turning as if someone was holding it from above and pushing it to the side to make it spin with a graceful motion. There was no wind or anything that could explain that movement. The wailing stopped, and my classmate immediately went up to check on her child who was sleeping. Everything seemed in order, but no one wanted or could sleep anymore. We dedicated ourselves to continuing working despite the fright and terror we experienced that night. We always say that thanks to La Llorona or whatever it was, we were able to finish that model.